Thanks, Chris. It's good to be here for sure. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about really three main topics here in the next 30 minutes or so. So, I'm going to start by basically just laying out how do we evaluate. Thanks, Chris. So, how do we evaluate profitability? And I'm going to take kind of a threefold approach. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out basic background. I'm going to kind of lay out a winter feed cost. And I do that because so many things that we do related to grazing, okay, they really involve, trying to replace some winter feeding days. That's kind of how we're going to start. Secondly, I'm going to lay out kind of a very basic rotational grazing system and talk about how that might impact profitability and how many days we actually need to get out of a rotational system to actually increase our profitability, given an investment in rotational grazing. And then third, I'm going to talk a little bit about stockpile fescue and kind of how some of the returns to a program like that look. So that's kind of where we're going to go. So start with this basic question of, what does a winter feeding day actually cost me? And I always say that I like to start here because this is the baseline. This is what we're chasing, right? If winter feeding days were dirt cheap, there'd be very little to graze. There'd be very little reason to graze. So really everything we do grazing-wise to me comes back to what am I actually going to be doing, what am I actually going to be replacing if I can extend my grazing season longer. So that's where we're going to start. So in terms of big hay production cost, I like to put this list up in front of farmers a lot of times, and I'll say, which hay costs are your biggest cost? And if I don't prep them with the list, oftentimes I'll get a hodgepodge of answers. Okay, now the biggest cost of hay production is typically fertilizer, okay? And we know that, all right? But it's not uncommon for a producer to say, well, it's fuel cost or something like that. Now, what's another realistic answer that I might get for the biggest hay production expense on that list? Machinery for sure, right? Yeah, okay. That also is a big one. And depending on the size of the operation, sometimes machinery cost per ton or per acre actually can be larger than fertilizer cost per acre. But just in terms of setting a baseline here, I'm going to lay out a very simple hay production scenario. So simple, typical farm, 3.5 tons an acre hay yield. Think grass type hays, okay? Some years be better, some years worse, kind of 3.5 on average. I'm going to plug in $50 for a land rent, and I want you to understand why I'm doing this. So I'm fully aware that in this part of the country that's a dirt cheap land rent, okay, for row crop ground, right? Okay, obviously for pasture ground things are different, and realistically hay ground is kind of somewhere in the middle. Okay, so I'm fully aware if this were hay ground that had row crop potential, okay, I'm way short on rental rate. On the same note, if this were more pasture type ground that didn't have row crop potential, this is honestly actually maybe a little bit high for actual pasture ground. Okay, so just trying to understand for purposes of this discussion, that's kind of where we're going to start. Then I'm going to lay out a very basic fertilizer assumption and machinery cost assumption. So again, I'm not an agronomist, but just kind of a basic numbers I'm going to use. 60 units of actual N, 60 units of actual P, and then 120 units of actual K. I'm going to use about a ton of lime per acre. Okay. Now, the prices that I'm using, I typically go to Illinois fertilizer prices and tack on kind of a transportation cost, and I'm usually in the ballpark when I do that, okay? So I've got urea cost at $4.25 a pound, I've got DAP at $5.50, and muriate of potash at $3.75, and this is obviously an odd time of year to be talking about hay production cost in one sense, right? So we think about typically spring would matter the most, but this is kind of roughly where our fertilizer cost would be right now. So that works out to be $46 per unit of actual N, 41 cents per unit of actual P. Understand I'm subtracting out the nitrogen value on the DAP, okay? And then about 31 cents on the muriate of potash for the K. Lime I'm pricing at 15 bucks a ton. But I plug just those simple things into a simple, hay production budget. I want you to understand based on my assumptions of fertilizer, okay, and then my 3.5 tons per acre yield assumption, I've got $46 a ton, okay, in that hay that I produce before I do anything other than just simply fertilizer, lime, and I've got my land rent in there, 50 bucks, okay? I think a lot of folks are surprised sometimes at how much that number can be. And again, what have I not done yet? No machinery, okay? And beyond the machinery, it's not just the machinery itself, it's also things like fuel, right? Repairs, maintenance, those sort of things. Now, it's easy. It's relatively easy for me to lay out some fertilizer assumptions. Okay, I can do that. We can argue about my ground's high in P, fine. But I mean, my point is I can lay out fertilizer assumptions reasonably easy. Okay, it's much harder for me to lay out machinery assumptions. Okay, so I cheat. Good economists cheat sometimes. Okay, and I cheat by using custom rates. And I look at our custom rate survey and say, okay, what do custom operators charge when they do machinery operations? And the reason I like to cheat that way is because the thing about custom operators are they have to be covering machinery depreciation. They have to be covering their time. They have to be covering fuel. They have to be covering repairs and maintenance. So I think it's a decent way to estimate machinery cost. And using Greg's last custom rate survey, for a 1,200-pound row bale, custom rate, complete custom harvest, and just for clarity, this was defined as cut, rake, and roll. Okay, just cut, rake, and roll. Okay, $20 per 1,200-pound roll works out to be 33 bucks a ton. Okay, so again, just ballpark. Okay, if we use that as an estimate for those machinery, labor, fuel, repair type cost, tack that on to my fertilizer assumptions, we've got about $79, $80 a ton. Okay, in the hay that we produce on the farm. That's going to vary, of course, across operations and by scale, but have that number in the back of your mind. And although this is not the focus of my talk today, I will make the point that whenever I show something like this, and I always kind of like to say to a group, okay, what's the market price of hay in your area, right? And it's oftentimes below this number. Okay. I always ask the question, well, is there an opportunity or possibility that we could simply buy hay, all right, and then focus more on our grazing operations? And I always like to kind of pitch that out there as an opportunity. And that's certainly a way to think about things in a program like this for sure. So again, if I were to give you my best guess at what a typical hay production cost is on a typical Kentucky cow-calf operation, I would say it's in the ballpark of 80 bucks a ton. Now, I can probably buy hay cheaper than that some years, certainly. Okay, now quality becomes a question mark as well. But if I've got $80 a ton in the hay that I'm producing, okay, that's what it costs me to produce, or it costs me to put out in front of the cattle, all right? In addition to that, though, when I start trying to think about what those winter feeding days cost, I've also got to account for storage and feeding losses. And I go back to some work that was done in Kentucky back in the early part, I think it was like 2000, 2001 when Mike Collins was here. Looked at different hay storage methods, but a lot of those, your really good storage methods. Hay stored inside under roof, really good wraps, sure, definitely under 10% storage loss, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, though, hay stored outside, we could see losses in the 25 to 40% range. Okay, so a lot of variation there. Not to mention hay feeding losses, right? There's definitely some loss in hay feeding. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about, what we kind of think of as grazing loss and utilization rate, right? But there's a loss on hay feeding as well. There's both the storage and feeding losses. But I personally feel like best case scenario for hay storage and feeding loss combined is about 15%. Okay, we can argue about that, but it's my best guess. Okay, but if I've got hay at 80 bucks a ton, and if I use this simple assumption that I've got 1,300-pound cows, right, which may even be small for some operations, right? Okay, but 1,300-pound cows and about 2.5% of their body weight a day. Okay, $80 a ton hay, 15% storage and feeding losses. I'm around $1.50 a day. Okay. And I use that number a lot when I talk to cow-calf operators because I think it's not a bad estimate for what a winter feeding day cost. A cow-calf operation, okay, that's producing and feeding their own hay. I can kind of fill this out, obviously, okay. If I don't do a very good job, if I store hay outside, if I don't use hay rings, if I do a pretty bad job managing my hay storage and feeding, I can be north of $2 a day. And I can fill out this next column with the $60 a ton hay. Think more. This is probably closer to market value right now. Okay, I'm still in this 115 to 175 range. So I always like to present things kind of in a sensitivity table format because we're all different. But I always kind of challenge folks to say, let's start with where we are on this chart. Okay, realistically think about what applies to your situation, and whatever that may be. When we start thinking about things we can do to increase our grazing season or add more grazing days, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to replace some of those winter feeding days, okay? And the value of an additional grazing day, okay, is what we don't spend on the winter feeding day it produces, or I'm sorry, that it replaces. Okay, that's kind of the premise of the talk that I'm going to give today. So my quick take on winter feeding costs, but I do like to start there because I do believe that very much is the baseline for a grazing operation. Now, I borrowed this chart years ago from, I think, Ray and Gary, and I've used it many, many times with their permission, but it just gives me an idea, okay? As I think about rotational grazing and I think about how I manage my grazing system, you know, what kind of utilization rate can I expect? And these are rules of thumb, right, Ray? But, you know, they give us an idea of what kind of loss, what kind of waste we're going to have given how intensive our grazing system is. And then the last thing I'm going to do before getting into some more of the nuts and bolts is I'm going to talk to you just a second about how economists view the world, right? It's no surprise that everybody hates economists, right? It's true, okay? We are the bad guys. You like, well, I appreciate it. I'm the exception, right? I believe that, yeah. But we view things marginally, okay? And by that, what we mean, just think about just a very simple example, okay? Let's say that I could spend an additional $50 an acre on my forage program, okay? And let's say that got me an additional 2 tons of forage production, okay? If that were the case, it's cost me $25 for each of those additional tons of forage production. So maybe I don't even fertilize my pasture at all, okay? Maybe I get a ton an acre by not fertilizing. Maybe I spend $50 on fertilizer and I get it up to 3 tons. Whatever the example might be, okay? I've got $25 in each of those tons of grazing. Each of those tons of forage production. And then the way that I like to think about utilization rate, okay? Utilization rate is how I turn forage into feed, okay? It's how I turn forage into feed. So at a 35% utilization, okay, meaning I'm wasting about 2/3, the other way to say that, right? I'm wasting about 2/3 of that, okay? That $25 a ton forage is really about $71 a ton in terms of feed. Now, it still may be cheaper than hay, I understand that, okay? But again, that's, you know, notice the difference in the two, though. That's kind of the cost of what I'm wasting, okay? Similarly, at 50% utilization, obviously my $25 a ton forage is $50 a ton feed. And then at 65%, my $25 a ton forage is $38 a ton feed. Okay, so that's why I think utilization rate is so important. And one of the questions that I always like to ask is, you know, why would you spend a lot of money improving your forage program? You know, better varieties, better yield, better quality, whatever you do, okay? Why would you want to do that and then waste 2/3 of it? Okay, and some of us do that sometimes, okay? But I'll come back to this later, but generally speaking, the more you invest in your forage program, okay, the more you're probably going to want to invest in your rotational grazing program to utilize a larger share of that, right? Okay, because the value of what you're wasting is going to go up as you spend more on your forage program. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind. So when we think about rotational grazing, and this is probably the most common way that people add grazing days to their operation. We use a rotational grazing system ourselves on the farm that I play farmer on evenings and weekends, okay? But you know, your typical system is going to involve mostly investment in things like fencing and watering, okay? And then certainly some time. So I'm going to just lay out a very simple rotational grazing system just to kind of give you an example. And I don't want the focus here to be on the individual costs that I assume they're all going to be different. But I want you to understand the concept, how I lay it out, and how I look at how that might be an investment that might pay us back over time. So I show this chart in settings like this sometimes, and I always joke about it. I'm sure you all have these nice square pastures, all right? But in reality, it doesn't make much difference on the internal fencing cost, okay? Now, obviously, the more square pastures are, in fact, the more circular they are, right, the cheaper exterior fencing is, okay? For internal, it doesn't quite mean the same, but bottom line, just imagine a 100-acre pasture with 50 cows on it, okay? No interior fence. There's a water source somewhere, obviously, there, and there's shade, what have you. But I've got no interior fence, and I basically got the animals making grazing decisions, right? Okay, they're going to overgraze parts, undergraze parts. They're going to heavily graze around the water sources and the shade trees at times. They're making the decisions. Now, if I were going to put this into a fairly intensive rotational grazing system, okay, and some of you may choose not to be this intense, and that's perfectly fine, right? Rotational grazing is not an either or an or, right? It's more of a spectrum, okay? But I could fence this 100 acres into 8 paddocks, okay? To do that, I'm going to need a fair amount of internal fence. I'm going to probably need some electric fence. I'm going to have a portable minnow feeder, and I'm going to buy two waters and set up a watering system. So the way that I'm kind of visioning this in my head is I'm going to run really 4 long internal fences, okay? I'll show you how I priced them in a second. I'm going to buy 2 water sources. I'm going to buy 2 water tanks, okay? And then I obviously had to assume that you had water to this place to begin with, okay? So all I'm going to do is I'm going to look, okay, now I've got to get water basically from whatever this main water source is, presumably on one of the ends, okay, and get it to both of these water sources. So again, I don't want you to focus on the nuts and bolts so much as understand that I have made an effort to try and price what would need to be priced in here, okay? And I actually went a little bit on the high side for a reason. So I priced 2 strands of aluminum wire, okay, which is obviously more expensive than polywire, right? And 2 strands, folks, is more than you honestly need for a rotational type system. Now, so I'm going to call this semi-permanent. It's not permanent. We have some of this that we can move. But, you know, to me, 2 strands of aluminum, this is probably going to be there a while, okay? We use a lot of polywire ourselves, okay? But that's how I priced it to make it a little bit higher. I went with metal post, had insulators included. They cost about $4.50 a post where I priced it. Again, plastic type step-in post, I can cut that almost in half, $2 to $2.50. Okay, so again, I went a little bit high on purpose. I did price 270-gallon water tanks. Could you get by smaller? Probably, but on the same note, 50 cows, you know, if you're not watching them closely, there's always a chance something can go wrong, and they can suck back 60, 100 gallons sometimes pretty quick, and then they knock that thing around, you got a problem. So I went a little bit heavy there too, but you could get this, you could get 100 gallons, I think, for probably more like 120 or so a tank, so something like that. I did price 1,600 feet of PVC pipe, which would put us basically from the water source up to this, you know, up to 3/4 of the way back in the pasture, okay? And then I did price a pretty good solar charger. I did buy a portable mineral feeder. You could buy 2 if you wanted to. I think 1's fine. They're pretty easy to move. Then I threw in $300 for kind of miscellaneous stuff. You're gonna need float valves. You're gonna need couplers. I would definitely want to buy a good fence tester with a fault finder. So put $300 or so. So I didn't price in labor setting this up, but there's going to be probably, I'm guessing, a couple of days of actually setting this up. What I want you to focus on, though, is what it would cost me to do this. Okay, a little over $4,000, $82 a cow. And I want you to understand, first of all, that, you know, when we see numbers like this, we see them in the present. Okay, we've got to learn to look at investments like this, though, over time. So as we kind of start thinking about that $82 investment per cow, based on my assumptions, and we can debate them for sure, okay? But, you know, how long would that last the way I priced it? Pretty darn good while, okay? I'm very comfortable putting a 5-year useful life on what I just put in place. Probably more like 10, okay? But even at 5, when I think about it that way, that 80-some bucks a cow is really less than 20 bucks a cow, okay? It's $16 a cow or so, okay? And then that's the number that I want to be thinking about as I'm thinking, okay, now how many more grazing days do I have to get to recoup 16 bucks a cow a year, okay? And again, at $1.50 a day, which I think is a pretty decent number to think about, I've only got to add 11 grazing days to, quote unquote, get my money back. And I think we all would agree that going to a system like that is pretty easily going to add 11 grazing days, okay? I think 30 to 60 is very possible depending on the year, okay? And if I can pull an additional 30 grazing days at $1.50 a day, I've increased my profit by 28 bucks a cow, okay? And I think in a good year, okay, I might could pull 60 more days. I've increased my profit by 73 bucks a cow. And this is how I like to look at grazing systems. What am I going to spend setting the system up, okay? And then how many more grazing days do I have to get out of that forage base, okay, to recoup that investment? I tell people you kind of got to avoid sticker shock, right? Because sticker shock's oftentimes the first year, right? It pays benefits over time. Now I'm presenting this as though we're going to see the benefit in terms of reduced hay feeding days. You know, what's another way that we can see economic benefit from a rotational grazing system? I might not feed more. I might not replace winter feeding days. I might not graze longer, but I might do what? Might run more cows, right? So you've got to decide whether that makes more sense to you. It's totally up to you. Some quick limitations, just so we're in the ballpark. So, like I said, I priced it kind of semi-permanent. Okay. We use reels and polywire, and they're much cheaper. And frankly, I like the flexibility that they give. Okay, because if we're going to be gone for 4 straight days, I just give them a little more pasture, right? It's that simple. Okay. Now, similarly with what I said about, if I wanted to, I could give them 2 paddocks. I could. Okay. But I like the flexibility of the poly wire. It takes a little more time, right? It's not a matter of opening the gate. I have to run fence, reel, this and that, but I like it. I didn't put any value on nutrient recycling, but there's no question the more I move those cattle around, right, the more uniform they're going to deposit their manure, okay? And there's going to be some benefits there in terms of fertility on a lot of the ground. I told you I didn't price in labor to set up the system. I also didn't put in labor moving the cattle. Part of the latter is because I set up kind of the semi-permanent system. But I always say this, there's a benefit to being out there more often and seeing those cattle, right? Anybody have pink eye trouble this year? Heavens, we did, okay? And I can tell you, being out there more often, catching that sooner, oftentimes pays benefits. So there's some benefits there as well, but certainly there's some cost. Last thing I'll say, I assume this PVC is on the ground, okay? So just for clarity and to be upfront with you about it, this is not a winter watering system the way I had it set up, okay? It would cost more to set it up that way. So I made the assumption that you've got some sort of, winter feeding pad or something somewhere else besides where we were, or you would just simply use one of those there in the front for winter feeding. So some limitations. My bias, though, on rotational grazing, when most people talk about it, they always talk more about this notion that I want to run more cows, and that's fine for a lot of folks, okay? It makes sense in some cases. But I actually feel like more often than that, producers would benefit, okay, not by adding more cows, okay, but by instead really just stretching that grazing season out and replacing some of those winter feeding days, right? Running the same number of cows but making more per cow may be more profitable than adding, 15% more cows to the operation. So understanding in general, it kind of depends on where you are. Folks that are overstocked, that are already seeing, weaning weight or conception rate issues, then I think you definitely want to keep your stocking rate the same. In general, low-cost producers, okay, who are already profitable, okay, probably do want to add more cows. That's probably what they want to do. A lot of folks I work with, though, kind of fall in this category where costs are fairly high to begin with, and I think it makes more sense, frankly, to just keep the cow herd the same and just focus on stretching those grazing season out, especially if you're producing your own hay and you're fairly small scale. That's certainly going to apply to you. Last thing I'll talk about will be stockpile fescue, but a very common strategy and kind of, I think, maybe number 2 in terms of adding grazing days requires some planning and requires some pasture that you can use to get off some pastures. So where I live, or where our farm is, this was a phenomenal year to stockpile fescue. We had good summer growth, so we didn't have a lot of trouble with pasture availability. So we were pretty easily able to get off some pastures for a period of time starting in late summer. But when you think about fall fertilization for stockpiling purposes, your biggest cost is certainly going to be nitrogen. Okay, what does that cost per unit actually apply? How responsive the nitrogen is, or I'm sorry, how responsive the pasture is to the nitrogen. So, generally speaking, the more moisture you have, and the sooner you apply the nitrogen, the better response you're going to get. No surprise there. This is one that doesn't get priced a lot, but it's certainly worth keeping in the back of your mind. Okay, the time you're not on that pasture has a cost. Okay, what are you doing during that 2-month stockpiling period? Are you feeding hay? Are you grazing something else? What are you doing? Okay, so that's something to always keep in the back of your mind. Utilization rate is big, and you really want to try and minimize losses. And fall fertilizer is not a cheap investment. Okay, so you definitely don't want to waste any more than you have to. At the same time, utilization rates in general will be better in the fall because you don't have the regrowth concerns from overgrazing. So you're going to definitely get more utilization by moving cattle more often, but you're probably going to see better than 35% anyway in the fall just due to that. We have a good publication on stockpile fescue, by the way, that I encourage you to look at. There's a very good one from the agronomy department. There's a very good one also from our department on the economics of it. So take a look at both of those and I can give you some guidelines. But again, just looking at nitrogen cost per ton, okay, and right now we're pretty close to this 50 cents per unit, roughly $3.40 a ton ammonium nitrate, and then nitrogen response. And there's some really good data to say that we can get 30 pounds or so response per unit of nitrogen if we get the fertilizer on by about mid-August or so. And here I'm assuming a 70% utilization rate, about 30 pounds of dry matter intake per cow. But I want you to notice, though, at current nitrogen prices, okay, and even at the lower response rate, okay, it's about $1.07 per day in grazing cost on the additional forage. But how is this going to compare to hay feeding days in most cases? It's going to be lower, right? And if I get really good response, okay, I might be in the ballpark of about half what those winter feeding days are, okay? So one reason why economists like things like stockpile fescue, fall fertilization is because most of the time, we are replacing expensive hay feeding days with much cheaper winter feeding days. I also want to, we're replacing expensive hay feeding days with fall grazing days. I want to see the exact same thing now, except now I'm holding that response rate constant, and I'm looking at utilization rate. And I want you to understand how much utilization rate impacts cost per day. So at 50% utilization, okay, that cost per day is about $1.20. I can get that down to about 86% if I can go to about 70%. Okay, and that's probably something, moving cattle maybe every other day, something like that, maybe something like that, Chris. So very doable for sure, and utilizing things like rotational grazing or strip grazing can certainly get you there. Last couple bullets I'll mention before I stop talking. There are a lot of other grazing crops that can be used, and the first couple bullets here are really options you could use possibly to give you something to graze while some of your fall pasture stockpiles. Okay, so we had our first experience grazing some corn this fall. It was very interesting. We grazed some in July and some in August. Learned a lot. The cattle loved it. I remember when my kids were small, we'd be playing outside and you would hear that obnoxious chime from an ice cream truck. Remember those days? All right. Okay, the kids take off running. All right. The cattle acted about that way when we'd give them some corn. Now, so it worked very well in terms of how they liked it. I thought they did very well on it. We learned a little bit too about how to set up the grazing system, and they pushed the fence a time or two on us. They liked it that much, but it was a very good experience for us. Summer annuals, pearl millet, Sudan, things like that. I really always say avoid sticker shock on these though too, because you will spend a lot more money per acre than you're used to spending, okay, on grazing. Okay? But understand you're getting a whole lot more production per acre too. Okay? So don't let the initial price scare you off. Sometimes those investments make a lot of sense, and you certainly want to make sure you're utilizing a large share of those if you're doing that. I would leave you with these thoughts, but the economist's perspective on grazing, in general, to improve your forage program, first of all, make profit the goal of the operation. And it seems silly, but it's not always the goal of every operation. It's not, okay? And I have some people tell me that it's not the goal, or I have someone tell me that it is their goal, but they also don't do some of the math that needs to be done to get a feel for what their costs are, okay? So you've got to make profit the goal of the operation. I'm a big believer that everything starts with understanding what those winter feeding days cost, okay? Those are probably your most expensive maintenance days every year, and everything starts there, okay? Vaccinating the grazing season, what are you trying to replace, okay? Definitely don't ignore utilization. Everything comes back to look for ways that you can add grazing days to replace some of those winter feeding days, and if that's not your take on it, okay, you've got to convince yourself on paper, okay, that by running more cows, right, you're going to have more profit to justify the investment in the grazing system. So I've kept us largely on time, pretty close, not bad for an economist. Questions? Questions for me?
Got time for a couple questions while I switch.
And I'll be around the rest of the day too, so I'm happy to talk with you during breaks and whatnot. But any questions before I sit down? Yes, sir. Sure. I learned that from my forage colleagues that really it's the 24 days you're off the pasture more than the 4 that you're on that really make the difference. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, sure.
Our operations dairy grazing.
Sure.
And our numbers for the wintertime feeding on dairy is $4 to $5 a hundredweight higher.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
than in the summertime.
Absolutely.
Pretty significant.
Your point being that you've got much higher winter feed costs on a dairy, so the value of those additional grazing days is even greater for a dairy operation. Yeah, yeah, excellent point. Absolutely, absolutely.
I think one of the areas that grazing dairies could benefit, especially if you're seasonal, is if you could move those cows onto stockpile tall fescue in the winter months off your primary milking platform and let those pastures rest. I mean, that was one of the almost perfect dairy grazing systems I've ever seen in Virginia. He would take all those cows off of his main milking platform, put them on stockpile tall fescue. They hold condition pretty well over the winter months, and then return them in the spring when they start to freshen. That was a pretty cheap way to overwinter those cows.
Thanks. I appreciate it.